Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride. All right, Wildsiders, we are so happy that you're tuning in today. As always, we have an amazing guest, and we are going to be speaking with Tom today on his experience and then also his parents' experience through the Holocaust, and kind of just picking Tom's brain and just getting to know him and getting to know what that experience was like for him with his parents being survivors of the Holocaust. And again, we are just so grateful and so happy to have you on today, Tom.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. You know, before we start getting into kind of the family history and stuff, do you want to share just a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Well, I'll start with my parents came to the United States in 1949. My brother was 2 years old at that point. I was born a year later in 1950. I grew up on Long Island, New York, went to school there. I was a ski racer growing up and went to UVM in Burlington, Vermont, and decided to stay in Vermont and lived in Vermont ever since.
That is amazing. A speed racer, is that what you said?
Ski racer.
Ski racer. That's
yes,
amazing.
Downhill skiing.
I was going to say, like, downhill skiing?
Yes.
Very nice.
Well, I came in second in New York State, both my junior and senior year of high school. But then when I went to UVM, well, my freshman year, my mother committed suicide. And that, I felt like I was the only one that ever lost a parent. And I was just burnt out from the skiing and being in the dumps, obviously, from my mother dying. Then I stopped the ski racing. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'm so sorry to hear that, Tom.
And I imagine that is a taxing extracurricular activity. I mean, that's a lot of time, a lot of work. It's not an easy thing. Just having to travel to get to the slopes and practice on the slopes. So I can see you being burnt out.
It was difficult for me to do the traveling, being on the ski team, and keeping up with studies.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
absolutely,
that was all part of it as well.
Yeah. I'm just kind of curious, how often do you reveal that your parents were Holocaust survivors? Is that something that comes up frequently? Is it something that doesn't come up as often?
I like to bring it up, if it fits.
Right. And then what are people's usual responses? Like, just from your perspective, anytime that comes up, what do you usually get as far as the feedback from people?
They're surprised and interested in hearing some of it, and sometimes a little bit more.
Yeah. Do you enjoy telling the story about your parents and their experiences and how that's impacted you, or is it a pretty difficult thing to get through?
It's difficult, and lots of times I show a lot of emotion and tears and stuff. I've been speaking in schools now for the last, 2.5 years. I have about a 35-minute presentation that I do in the beginning when the teachers would say, what do you need? The first thing I would say is a box of tissues. Besides, they were thinking of a glass of water or a cup of coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go through 5 or 6 of them as I'm going through it. But I don't mind showing the emotion as I've done it. I've done it now about 45 times to a few different groups, met most of them schools, trying to educate kids about the Holocaust and tell my family's story. Now I do it without tears, but mainly because I've done it so many times.
Yeah. Is it still therapeutic for you at this point, or is it still, or would you say it's just plain old difficult.
It's difficult, but I want people to hear the story. The Holocaust shouldn't go away
Yeah.
in people's minds. I mean, in history.
Hmm.
And as I say in my video, I'm doing what my father would be doing if he was still alive. Uh,
Hmm.
he if he had the time, he wanted to talk about it because he didn't want people to not know what happened.
Right. Yeah, Tom, that was going to be my question is how did this, meaning you going and speaking to schools and being on an informative type of platform, how did that happen? Is it something that you sought out? Did somebody come to you? Was it just one of those, it was you were in the right place at the right time? How did that happen?
So I'm not one to be a public speaker, stand up in front of groups at a dinner party. I'm the quiet one.
Hmm.
So I was at a Yom HaShoah, April of 22, and I was just at a group at the library in Burlington, and a few people went up and lit a candle for the 11 million that were murdered, 6 million Jews, and then another 5 million of other minorities. And there was a gal next to me that went up and talked about that she taught as a teacher at the nearby school. And then afterwards, she turned to me and said, "What is your connection to the Holocaust?" So I told her that my parents were Holocaust survivors, and she said, "Oh my God, I would love for you to come in and speak in my class." So she helped me I put together the story pretty quickly, and 2 weeks later, I spoke to her class, and she helped me with a slideshow. And my father had spoken in the school for my middle son's class in 1994. So I have that video, and we took a few excerpts of my father speaking, and I have those within my speech so that the students can hear my father speaking, and it's not just me speaking about what happened to somebody else. And that's how it started. And then I did reach out to other schools through the Vermont Holocaust Memorial Group, which I'm on the board. Gotten me leads at different schools. Um,
I think that's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, kind of on a personal note, Tom, I am so it's hard to use the word fan because that sounds like such an inappropriate word, but I am such a strong believer in keeping the memory of the Holocaust, the information alive. I just recently read, I might actually, do I have it here? Yeah, I actually have it here on my desk. I just finished reading The Tattooist of Auschwitz. I was so happy to see that they had turned that into, I believe it's a movie or a series. I've been to the Holocaust Memorial Museum there in Washington, D.C. I just feel very, very passionate. Anytime that I sub at a school and they're covering that, in their curriculum, I just feel like it's something that people have got to remember. It's so important to know that this was a part of history and part of the world's history, not just, Jewish history or European history. I mean, this affected the entire world. So, like I said, just on a selfish, I just wanted to say on a personal note, I am so excited because this is something that I feel extremely passionate about as well, even though I do not have a personal connection to it. And I'm so glad to know that there are other people out there who are keeping this memory alive. And I'm really excited to hear, again, more about your family and how it impacted you and how it impacted your family. So I guess that was my rant. And my first question, Tom, for you is where did your mom and dad, where are they from? Where did they grow up? Did they grow up in the same town? How did that all begin?
okay, and you spoke about The Tattooist becoming a movie. Well, I'm going to do a plug for a movie that's not made yet, but there
Ooh.
a classmate of mine from my high school actually wrote a screenplay, and we're hoping to make a movie of my parents' family story.
Oh my
Yay! Oh,
gosh.
this
So,
is so
so I'll do a
exciting.
plug for a movie that hasn't been made yet,
And like I said,
but
I knew
we're
that
trying.
Yeah, well, and I know that that's such a strange reaction for me to be like, yay, a Holocaust movie, because it is such a horrific thing. But like I said, I just feel so passionate about making sure that the future generations understand. I'm a history person anyway. I'm like, we've got to learn from history. We've got to make sure that this stuff never happens again. So I'm so excited. When you know more about the evolution of this movie process, please let us know.
I definitely will. So, my mother was born in Vienna, Austria. My father was born in a small town south of Prague in Czechoslovakia, town of Votice. My mother and her parents moved to Prague. I'm not sure when, how old she was, but I think a young child.
Mhm.
There's a 14-year difference between my parents' age. My father is older. My father played bridge with my mother's parents at their house, and the story goes that as she became a teenager, she went after my father. I had some guy at the bridge table in the next room. So they're in Prague. The Nazis took over all of Czechoslovakia on March 15th, 1939. They were dating. 39, my mother is 18 years old.
Mhm.
My father is, I don't know, 32. And they got married exactly 1 month later, on April 15th, 1939. They knew that things were happening in the world, and they thought to themselves, well, maybe they won't separate families. They didn't know what was happening. They didn't know in 1939, they didn't know about, all the killing or what, concentration camps and so on. Of course, that didn't work.
Right.
So my father's cousin, who grew up like a brother to my father, because his parents died when he was a young teenager, and my grandparents adopted him and took him in. He left when he could, when the Nazis took over Czechoslovakia. I think there was about 3 days when you could leave before you couldn't leave. And so he was outside. He heard Hitler speaking in Berlin, and he wrote to my father, begged and pleaded, "You've got to get out, do whatever you can. This is not going to be good." So, but my father tried. We have some letters that he wrote to people in the United States. You would have to have a sponsor, you had to pay some money, and so on. So my father was trying, but his father and mother would not leave Czechoslovakia. They felt like they were old. They only knew Czech language. They had their lives, their business, their home, family, or friends, and they wouldn't leave. And my father wouldn't leave without him, so they stayed. Um,
Real quick, kind of on that, thinking about that, don't you think that that's probably a pretty normal thought process? Like, even though somebody's telling you something's going to be bad, like, there's no way that your brain can compute how bad it would have been. You know what I
exa-
mean?
exactly, and many people don't know how bad it was unless you get into it. There's so many people who just don't know how bad people were tortured,
Right.
and obviously many, many died.
Right. But yeah, and just that idea of like, why wouldn't someone leave if they were being warned? And I'm thinking, well, if we were in that situation, we'd be like, I mean, it's probably going to be chaotic for a little bit, but what's the worst that can happen? I've got to believe that that's a normal, just human response to things. So I can see how your grandparents would say, like, I mean, we're not going to leave. We have our business here. We have everything here. And then your dad wanting to support that and not leave his family. I mean, again, that I feel like that is something that if I had been in that situation, I would have probably done as well.
Yeah,
And
it's
so the letters were sent to them. Your grandparents were like, no, we're going to stay. What happened after that, Tom?
so before they were taken to the ghetto and so on. I mean, life got closed in and got worse and worse. Jewish people had to wear the Star of David on their clothing to reveal that they were Jewish. They were not allowed to work in certain jobs. They had to do only manual labor. They couldn't work in offices and so on. Their businesses were taken away from them. They couldn't go to a park. They couldn't go to certain restaurants. The world was closing in on them. So my father, along with one of his uncles, started smuggling money and valuables of their own and for other family members and maybe friends, I don't know, to his cousin, who at this point was in Paris. They would go to a train yard late at night and put a package underneath a train and mark down what the car number was in the train, and then tell his cousin who was in Paris what train number and car number it was, and he would get the package when it got to Paris. Well, that worked well for a while, but then they got caught. And my father's uncle and my father went to a German Gestapo prison, and he was in prison for approximately 10 months. This is before being taken away. His father had to come up with a lot of Czech crowns and dollars, which he was able to, I think, get from a customer in the United States, and finally got him released. I think he paid like 3 or 4 months even before they were released, and he was beaten terribly while he was in prison. But like I say, the beating he got there was nothing compared to what was had in the concentration camps. So then in October of 1941, the Nazis arranged for 5 transports of 1,000 each from Prague to the Lodz ghetto, LODZ ghetto in Poland. They were on the second transport, along with his parents, my mother's parents, and my mother's younger brother, who was 4 years younger than my mother. Out of those 5,000, I'm not sure exactly what the number is, but only 135 survived, and only 19 couples. And you can see I'm getting a little emotional saying it. So I feel so blessed that I'm alive, that they survived, and I have the life that I do, the family and so on. I mean, I just count my blessings every day.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing when you look at that through that perspective, how everything went so wrong, and yet they still were able to fight and survive and give you and your siblings a good life.
So now your mom and dad were together on that second transport, is that correct?
Correct. Along with the parents, well, my uncle, my mother's brother.
Now, you said that they were transported to Poland?
Correct. To
Is that
the
correct?
Lodz, LODZ ghetto. That ghetto had approximately 150 to 200,000 in this ghetto. And the ghetto, as opposed to a concentration camp, the ghetto was like a closed-in town. There's a fence around it. The Lodz ghetto was approximately 1 mile by 1 mile, with 150 to 200,000. And the numbers vary because some people left, some more came in. Only about 20% of the housing had plumbing. You can imagine how nice that is. And I believe, and I've done some research, I think there were 7 to 9 like to a room. They're just awful, awful conditions. I grew up here, and my father said many, many times that there was very little food, there was lots of disease. My father would say many times that in normal times you wouldn't feed that food to pigs, but they would eat whatever they could. They did get some things, I heard, from family members. Family members would try and send some food in. My father would say, yeah, by the time the food got there, it was rotten, but the women did something with it anyway, and we still ate it.
Wow.
During that time in the Lodz ghetto, my mother got typhus. She had 104 temperature for a period of 3 months. At 106, she died.
Oh my
How she
gosh.
survived that, I don't know.
This was your
Uh,
grandmother.
no, my mother. My
Oh, this
mother.
was your mother.
My
Okay,
mother.
gotcha.
Okay, so a few months after being in the Lodz ghetto. They got there in October of 41. In February, I believe, of 42, my uncle Fedor, my mother's brother, was starving. Conditions were awful. And he's like, I got to get out of here. And there were many, many transports leaving the ghetto. And he said, okay, this is the worst. I got to get out of here. I'm leaving. I'm getting on one of these transports, not knowing where it was going, but he's hoping for something better. And my mother's parents went with him because didn't let him travel alone. That's the last they ever heard from them. They obviously were taken to somewhere and were killed. In August of 42, so now they've been there for 9 or 10 months, my father's father, Zygmunt, died on August 18th, 1942, which happens to be my middle son's birthday. And my father dug his grave in a cemetery there. My father never forgot the number of the cemetery, LX303, because his father begged my father to transport his body to Prague and to be buried where his parents were buried. So my father never forgot that number. After the war, he went back there and tried to get his body, but he didn't have a casket. He tried to cover it with some wood just to preserve the body, but the cemetery was so devastated that he couldn't come up with the bones. So he just, on the gravestone in Prague, he just put in memory of his father.
Oh, how amazing that he tried to do that, though.
No, my father was amazing. And then 3 weeks after my grandfather died, my grandmother, Ludmilla, was taken away, never to be seen again.
Right.
There was something called a selection, and the older people, the people that they, couldn't work
Right.
or produce for them, were taken away. And again, now it was just my parents that were left.
And to this day, they have no idea where they went or what happened to them?
No, they don't know. Well, they know they were killed, but no, they don't know where. And then my parents were in Lodz till they liquidated Lodz in August of 1944. So almost 3 years. They were taken on a crowded cattle car and went to Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, they were in front of Dr. Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death. And there you met your destiny. As you walked up in front of him, he pointed either to the right or to the left. I believe to the right, you were safe, and to the left, you went to the gas chambers. And my father moved to the back of the line of the men, and my mother was in the front of the line of the women. And that way, my mother saw that she went to the same side as my father. And she said many times that gave her the strength to continue, that she knew that if there was any way to survive, that my father would find a way.
Hmm. This is gonna be a hard Ooh, Tom. This is gonna be a hard interview.
You guys getting torn up is tearing me up, but that's okay.
I'm sorry. I just, ooh.
So now they're separated in Auschwitz. The men and women are separated. My father said that the men were put in a room. They were had to strip naked. They were in a crowded room. A German soldier then whipped them from one end of the room to the other. Then they were given their clothing, which was, striped shirt and pants and wooden Crocs. And my father used to go, yeah, we got wooden Crocs, but they had got holes in them, in the soles. So then they're basically walking barefoot through whatever weather. So my mother from Auschwitz was a few weeks later or a month later taken to a camp called Gross Rosen, where she worked in an underground munitions factory. All my life, I always heard that my mother had it much easier than my father. Of course, nobody had it easy. So many died. So many were killed. So many died. So many suffered and starved and were beaten to death. nobody had it easy, but all I heard was, oh, my father had it much worse. So my father was in 9 different camps. In September of 44, he was taken to Riedelo, which is in the southern part of Germany, in the Bavarian section. So from Auschwitz, they took 640 of the strongest men who were told that they were being put on a 3-day train ride that was going to bring them to the next camp. Of course, this is crowded, cattle cars stuffed like sardines. Cattle car moves and they don't even sweat. No facilities, no nothing. Many died on the way. My father used to say, yes, they gave us food. Then they gave him food for the 3 days in the beginning. My father used to go, yeah, a few portions of bread. He would go like this, just show us a small piece of bread, a few slices of salami, and that's it. So in the beginning of the trip, my father ate it all. He said that way, for once, he felt a little bit better, and also nobody could take it from him. So he didn't eat for 3 days. Then they get to the camp, and they expected to be fed when they got to the next camp. They still were not fed that day. Go ahead.
I have a question. I guess I haven't heard a lot, and I'm not a Holocaust expert by any means. I mean, I know a lot about it because my husband also is a huge history buff, and we talk a lot about things like when he learns about something or something comes up. But I guess I'm just kind of surprised to hear that your parents made it out of Auschwitz, because I think in any terms that you hear Auschwitz brought up, I mean, that's nobody ever gets to leave there, right? And so when you said that they left, I just wasn't expecting that.
Mm-hmm. I guess they kept the stronger, younger people because they made them work. They made them build railroads. They made them build factories. Like my mother was in a munitions factory. So they made them work for the German cause.
Well, and Tom, that was one thing that I just recently was exposed to, kind of what Bailey was saying, is I didn't realize how often they moved people between camps.
They moved the men to the Riedelo. It was a new camp, and made them build it, actually, build the facility, made them work. Many of them worked building roads, going to factories and so on. So they moved them around where they needed them. They also moved them around when the Americans and the Russians were moving in, uh,
Oh,
and they
to
wanted
kind of
to
hide them almost, right?
hide them and then clean up the camps so people didn't know what happened.
I was going to say, I know that I was under the impression that there was a lot of when the Russians, well, primarily when the Americans got involved in the war, that it was a lot of like, let's kind of put some lipstick on this pig of a situation, if you will, to try to say like, oh no, nothing's going on over here. It's not as bad as everybody thinks, which that the whole thing is just flabbergasting to me. So now your father went to a camp outside of Auschwitz, but your mother stayed closer to that area. She was still within Auschwitz, or she was also moved out.
So she went to the other camp called Gross Rosen. I'm
Gross
not
Rosen.
sure.
Okay.
I think it was on the border of Germany and Czechoslovakia.
Okay.
And then eventually she was freed on May 8th, 1945, and brought back to Prague. I'm not sure exactly how. I don't know, like I say in my video, I don't know much more about what happened to my mother. She didn't talk about it. My father would talk about it, but I joked very many, many times. My father was amazing, but he was the world's worst teacher. So growing up, it was very hard for me to ask any questions and get any answers. If I would ask a question, he expected me to know what the answer was. So I never really felt comfortable asking. But of course, just a little kid. I'm born a year after they came to the United States, only a few years after, and my mother didn't talk about it. people have asked me or I've been asked, and it's like, well, I don't know whether she didn't talk about it because she didn't want me to start crying about hearing what happened, or because it was too hard for her to relive it
Sure.
and to talk about it. My parents would speak Czech very often together because I mean my mother didn't speak a language. It's harder for her to learn than my father, and that was their language that they spoke. So many times I would say speak English, but so
Mm.
I don't know what they were talking about, whether they were talking about what happened or
Did they teach you the language? Did you ever learn it?
no. My brother understood it. He was born in, had a couple years of Czech before coming to the United States. He would understand it, but he never spoke it. But they always said, nobody, it's Czech is such a small language, there's no reason for you to try and, learn it.
That's interesting.
And then,
So, Tom, you had mentioned that your mother was freed, went back to Prague. Was that a similar situation with your father? Was he also freed at I guess at the end of the war, and did he travel back to Prague as well?
yes, there's more I should probably tell you about what my father went through.
Yes, please
You
do.
want? Okay.
Yes, please do.
So in that camp, some of what he survived and then some of the others, they would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, march 5 miles, do hard physical labor all day, and then 5 miles back, returning at 8 o'clock at night. So many of the men were dying every day. Then my father then didn't have to do that, but he had to dig the mass graves for those that died. And he buried 256. All my life, I heard him say that number and never forgot it, of fellow prisoners, friends. So he would have to carry the bodies over his shoulder and, dig the graves, the mass graves, and then place them in those graves. But before he could do that, he had to look in their mouths and see whether they had any gold or silver in their teeth, and then pull their teeth and give them to the guards so that they had the gold and silver. So anyway, so my father was in this camp, and in this camp there was actually one nice guard. While my father was delivering coal to the officers' cabins, he passed one guard, said to him that in cabin number 18 there's a bowl of soup. Have it. If he ever would have been, if anybody ever saw him doing that, he would have been shot right on the spot. So my father, when he was going to the cabins, he saw a German newspaper. So he quickly looked at the headlines, and it showed that the Americans were approaching. That gave him a little hope that maybe the end was near. Now, this was only in January. He was there from September until January of 45. And they moved him on to Dachau, and Dachau to Borgau and Horgau, Augsburg, not doing them in order, and Turkheim, and I don't know. But he went to a number of camps. He was in 9 altogether. Then in April of 45, as he said, it was his final hunger march. And he had to march 60 miles. Like I say in my video, I can't imagine marching 60 miles after 3.5 years of starving and being, I think at this point he weighs 90 pounds. So they marched up 53 miles and they get to Dachau. They have to stand there for hours before in the early morning. And then Dachau says, no, we don't have room. Then they had to march on another 7 miles, and he went to Allach, Allach, close by. These are all sub-camps of Dachau. Many of those camps are just plain called Dachau. And so he's there, and then on April 30th, bombs are flying overhead. The Americans are bombing the Germans, and then they wake up in the morning, and it's all quiet. And they peek out from where they're sleeping. The Americans come in, the Germans are gone, the Americans come in, and then the Americans the soldiers are shocked at how emaciated and starved the prisoners are. And this is something my father could talk about stuff that happened without becoming, emotional. But when he talked about this, he would get emotional. So the soldiers start giving them all their food, which is fatty stuff like ham and chocolate. And he begged the others not to eat too much. Somehow he knew that eating too much after starving and just being skin and bones, you can die from that. But many of the others didn't listen to him, and they ate too much, and many of them died after being freed. So there's something that's called the refeeding syndrome, which wasn't known until actually the Holocaust and World War II, which is, you know, what you can die from, obviously.
Yeah. I had heard that before somewhere
That's
that
called the refeeding syndrome. So then they moved him to a hospital to get him some strength. He was in the hospital for approximately 3 weeks and de-lice him. He used to talk about the lice jumping from one to another. He said there were hundreds of lice on their bodies. They're scratching like crazy. And then they took him by truck and train and whatever back to Prague. And he called a friend who had owned a construction company. And all he wanted to know was whether my mother survived. And he got the good news and went to where my mother was. And so I forgot to tell you one thing that my father did. So before the war, he buried $100 bill. He went to this place of birth and he buried $100 bill in a tin can by a tree. So just in case to have something to start with after the war. So my mother and he went to Vatitsa and they found the $100 and that's what they started their life with in 1945.
that's amazing. Your dad,
Yeah.
man, he was so resilient and so strong in so many ways.
Mm-hmm. And so clever. And his willpower to live. He used to say the Germans might win the battle, but that he would win the war. And he did.
That's incredible. Tom, it's kind of funny for me because I'm always making fun, obviously, in just good fun of my husband because my husband is one of those who is very, very thought out. He's very, like just in case type of personality. Like, for example, he's going to be going on a hunting trip and the place you don't have to register until 11 o'clock in the morning. We live an hour and a half away from this place, but by golly, he's going to get on the road at 6 o'clock. That way he makes sure that, he's there on time. And so I've always thought, in my naivety, these personalities where I'm like, why do you need to be that, far thinking, or why do you need to be that cautious? But I just am so appreciative. I've learned to become so appreciative of personalities like my husband, and I hear a lot of that with your father. Like I'm so appreciative that he had that forward thinking, that hopeful thinking to say, hey, just in case, we're gonna bury some money and hopefully I'm gonna get back with my wife and we're gonna start a life like that. Like I think that little aspect of all the aspects, that little aspect is really something that so many people could learn from. Is you've always got, plan ahead, be hopeful for a better future.
So after the war, my father got back into business, which was the feather and down business, which was his father, his father's father, and every generation. And what happened was a supplier or a customer, maybe both, of theirs was not Jewish during the war was buying feathers. Feathers and down is something that you buy as a byproduct when duck and geese are being killed for the meat. the farmers then have the feathers and down from the ducks and the geese, and you need to buy that product when it's available. So this gentleman was buying and buying during the war, and he was saving it actually in a third floor of a church outside of Prague. And he found out that my father survived, and he went to my father and said, "Would you like to get back into the feather business?" And this gentleman only spoke Czech, and he didn't really know about selling in other countries like my father did. My father spoke 5 languages, French and English and Catalan and Polish and Czech and German. Anyway, and he knew customers, all over the world, the United States and other countries. So this gentleman wanted my father to get in business. So they did. And one of the things that my father did when he was in business with him, with his partner knowing, of course, was when he sold some merchandise to a customer in New York, he would invoice him for less than the merchandise was worth. And he trusted the gentleman to put the difference in a bank account for my father. And talk about thinking ahead in case something ever happened and he had to get some money out of the country. I always can't say I kicked myself because I never asked my father how much. I would like, wanted to know how much, whether, $10 or $5,000 or how much it was. But anyway, another clever thing that my father did. So as I was saying, as I say in my video, so all was going well. My brother was born in 1947, and then in February 25th of 1948, the Czech Communist Party took over Czechoslovakia, and they could see the handwriting on the wall. And my mother said to my father, "We missed one train. We're not missing another one. Victor, find a way out of here." So my father is thinking, and he realizes that there's a gentleman who was in the fur business, and he was married and had children or a child, and he realizes that he's not around anymore. So my father figures that the fur business is big in Frankfurt, Germany. So at this point, my father is selling feathers for the government, for the Czech government, because it's communist. So he goes to the government and he says to them, "There's a really good market in Germany. I think I need to sell feathers in Germany." And they said, "Yeah, okay, that's fine. You can go. But if you don't come back, you'll never see your wife and child alive again." He goes, "Oh, no, I'll be back. Oh, no." So he goes to Frankfurt. He tracks this gentleman down. This gentleman doesn't want to tell him how he got out, but eventually my father gets it out of him. And he tells him, and he says that there's this gentleman, and he tells him where he is, and he'll arrange for you to get out of Prague. And my father goes to this gentleman. The gentleman says, doesn't want to say that he knows anything about doing anything, but my father gets it out of him, and then he has to pay him quite a bit of money, but he arranges for my father and my mother and brother to get on a train of Polish Jews heading for Israel. And a few weeks later, he gets them on this train, and then they get out of the train. They don't want to go to Israel. They want to go to the United States. So they get off the train in Stuttgart, Germany. Then they make their way to Frankfurt. And there they find somebody to get them visas to come to the United States. And it turns out that these people are the Crosses. And the Crosses were taken on the same transport as my parents, the second transport out of 5, to the Lodz Ghetto. The men and women, they were together through most of the war. Not quite to the very end. This family was like this couple and they had a daughter. She's like a sister to me. They were like family. When they came to the United States, also, we would see them just about every weekend. They were both families lost so many relatives that really they were so close. Anyway, so they signed these visas, but they couldn't come to the United States right away because the United States was only allowing 2,000 Czech refugees to come to the United States, and they had to wait in Frankfurt for 10 months before coming to the United States. And then in March of 49, they eventually made it to the United States. And my father's cousin that is living in Kingston, New York, then about 90 miles north of New York City. They live with them. My father goes to New York. He starts up the feather business. He commutes to the city during the week, on the weekends back to Kingston. And then eventually they buy a house in South Hempstead, Long Island, and then in Roslyn Heights, and that's where I grew up.
Wow, that is amazing. That's so amazing. Was it scary for your parents having to wait in Stuttgart and Frankfurt for those 10 months, saying that they just went through this horrific experience with, the Nazi portion of Germany?
Well, I'm sure it was scary. They could have gone immediately to Canada, to Israel, to Switzerland. I think there was another country, but they wanted to come to the United States.
Did they say
I don't know how
why?
scary. I mean, it had to have been,
Yeah.
hard times.
Did they say why they were set on traveling to the United States? Did they ever express that?
No, my father's cousin lived in the United States. He had done business with people in the United States. I mean, he did people with business with people in other countries, but
He also
um,
had a little bit of savings already in New
That's
York,
true.
right?
yes, they did.
That's
Yep.
true in New York. So, Tom, for you growing up, when is the earliest that you remember learning that your parent, is it something that you always knew that your parents were Holocaust survivors? Do you have a moment where you remember learning that for the first time? Or was it something that you were like, I don't really remember when I learned it. It was just always part of our family.
I think it was just always part of my family. I can't tell you when. I think whenever babies start understanding anything, it was there. When that other couple came. I mean, they were there before I was born. They came on Thanksgiving in 1949. I'm born in January of 1950, so they were there when I was born. I celebrated Thanksgiving with them every year.
Is this the
That's our
Cross
big celebration of the year.
Cross family? Is that
The
correct?
process. Yeah.
So you mentioned that your dad went back to Poland, correct? To try to find his father and take him back home and bury him back in Czechoslovakia. Did your dad ever go back? Did you ever go with him to see any of these places? Did you ever do something like that?
So in 1987, my father took my wife and my three sons and myself to Europe. We went to Prague. We traveled around different places. And one of the places he wanted to take us was to where he had been. And he took us to Dachau. There he showed us, I couldn't believe that he could walk through it, but he has taken quite a few people to Dachau. He walked us to where the gas chambers were. I couldn't believe he did. He told us of the stench when the bodies were being burned. I mean, it's huge. It's amazing. It's amazing. He showed us where they stayed. A bunk room. The room there, which in most of the barracks are just taken down, and it's just foundations, one foundation after another, the cement foundations, and nothing there. But there's here and there's a barrack. The bunk room he showed us was maybe 6 feet by 4 feet. There were 6 men assigned to that room, three bunks, one on top of another. So 2 men to each bunk, which was maybe a foot and a half, 2 feet wide. And he said during the day, all the 6 men had to sit on the top bunk side by side, doing nothing all day, hunched over because there's only about a foot and a half of room, so they can't even sit up. Skin and bones on a wooden bunk all day long. But if you knew my father doing nothing all day long, that torture. On the floor was a bucket for when Major called. When the bucket was full, one of the men would have to take the bucket and run with it to the end of the hall and dump it. If he spilled any of it, he had to take his bare butt and get down on the cement and clean it. I can't imagine.
And I think that really
I
is
mean,
as
just some of the things that uh, you just can't imagine doing this to human beings.
I was gonna say, I don't know if it's like, can our minds even really try to imagine? When you, because I keep saying the same thing where it's like, I can't imagine. And, Bailey being a or excuse me, Bailey being a therapist, I'm sure that there's there's some research behind that on like, I'm sure that that's a protective mechanism where it's like, we can't even fathom what that would actually be like. And I think that's why it's so important to hear these stories, to get that visual of like, can you imagine trying to take a bucket? Can you imagine sitting with no, leeway on a wooden bunk all day? Like, can you just even try to imagine these things? And it's just, there are
And
no
seeing
words.
and seeing that room was like, oh,
And like you said,
so
and how your
so
father was
something.
able to show that to you again, like how he was able to walk you through that again, is that in itself is unbelievable to me.
He was so tough. You never saw any emotion out of him. And I always wonder whether, well, I think it's a combination of both. I think he was so tough, and that's what got him through it. And on the other hand, what he went through, nothing else was ever so bad afterwards. We used to go skiing, and the back in the 50s and 60s, the lifts would open at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he had to be the first one on the lift. So, no matter how cold it was, it could be 20 below zero, and he's waiting 20 minutes before he's online 20 minutes before the lift opens so that he can be the first one up the mountain. And, and, like I say, 20 below zero, and he would never get cold. The only time we would ever go in to warm up is, I'm an 8-year-old skiing and I'm crying, and I've got frostbite. Okay, we'll go in. We'll go in. You want to know how it affected me. So one of the stories that I heard all my life, and I could never ask my father about this story. I would hear the story. You asked when I started hearing stuff. So you're in the next room. I'm a little kid. I'm 3 years old, 5, 8. I'm 15. I'm 20. We're at a dinner table. He's telling other people. So here's the story. And one of the things he said was sometimes at your roll call, the guards would go and point to two people. They go, you and you, step forward. We're going to give you a stick and you're going to beat the other person until he's dead. If you don't do it, we're going to give the other guy the stick and he's going to beat you until you're dead. If you don't do it, if neither one of you does it, I'll do, and I'll kill both of you. So all my life, I hear this story, but I could never ask my father if he ever did that. Did he ever kill anybody? Obviously, he wasn't killed. So when we were in Dachau, my kids are at that point, or maybe 12, 11, and 6 or 7, something like that, and we're walking past from the gas chambers back to where the barracks were, and we're by one of the foundations, and we just stop, and it's just my family and he brings up that story, and he tells us that story. I was surprised because my kids are kind of young to hear that story, and he just says that story, and when he tells that story, I asked my father, I said, Dad, did you ever have to do this? And he goes, no, I was never picked. And at that point, I just broke down and cried. It was just like such a relief. Here I am about 37 years old. So it's like half my life. I live with that, but I didn't realize what such a burden on me that I heard it and heard it and heard it. I mean, over and over and over, I've heard that story.
I mean, I think I just find myself, Tom, like feeling like there's, I feel like this a lot when I do therapy with people who have shared a heavy trauma with me, and a lot of times there are just no sufficient words, right? There's no sufficient words to match the feeling and the emotion that you're experiencing. And I just sit here and I'm just thinking, because I have also been to Dachau. So from somebody who does not have a father or a parent who went through the Holocaust, just going through Dachau was very, I don't even know if I have the words to put to it, but it was very sobering. It was very heavy. It was very, all of the things. And then when I heard you start saying that your dad was in Dachau, I am having flashes of memory of being there and, walking the grounds. And now it's like it makes it more personable,
Do
right?
you
Because
do you remember seeing the bunk room that I described?
yes,
Were you able
yeah.
to? Yeah,
And I
it was
remember
about that
thinking, like,
size, right?
there's human men cannot fit here, right? There's
What's that?
there's no way. I remember thinking,
Yeah,
like, human men cannot fit
yeah.
in these
I-
these
Is that
bunks.
about the size of it? Am I remembering it
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah, yeah. Awful.
And I just remember,
And you
like I
probably and you probably didn't know that 6 men were assigned to that bunk, to that room, right? But if you were just seeing it, you didn't have somebody tell you that there were six. You
well, we
probably
went on
saw three
there was
bunks.
a
Did
tour
you have a
guide,
guide that told
so
you?
yeah,
Okay.
they walked us through all of that stuff, and of course, it's been probably a lot because I have been within the last couple of years, but you probably went.
We went in 87, so it was a long time
Yes.
ago.
Yeah, so now they have a museum at the front of it
Yes,
where
there
it
was a museum.
okay,
Yeah, that's when we walked in and you see the uniform that they might be wearing and the wooden Crocs. And
yeah,
my father looked at those Crocs. Yeah, those are new. Mine had holes in the bottom. Look,
yeah, yeah, and just to have the visual of being at Dachau and then hearing, seeing you and hearing about you, sharing about your dad, and it makes it that much more relative and that much more close, and it's even more of that feeling that I was trying to describe earlier, which is again, I think what Chelsea was saying at the beginning of this is why it's so important because it's so easy for us to distance, right? It's so easy for us to think of the term Holocaust and that happened a long time ago. Yes, it was awful. Yes, it was tragic. And then we keep on. But whenever you can speak with somebody with a personal experience with something, it makes it so much closer to home. And I think humans, we need to keep that going, right?
Well, and Bailey too, and Tom as well. I mean, I know that I hope that you guys, I'm sure you've heard that there are even people who are denying the existence. Like the au- the audacity. I just can't believe that there are people who are literally denying that these things happened or downplaying it to the point where it was like, I mean, yeah, it kind of happened, but it wasn't that bad. And that's where I am like, I obviously feel that it's so important for this information to be shared, for this memory to stay alive. And I think, Tom, we touched on it a little bit, but what are your hopes as far as, keeping this memory alive? What are your hopes with sharing your story and sharing your family's story?
well, I mean, the reason I'm getting out there is to share what happened. I can't imagine that anybody listening to my story, well, the children or other groups, the Rotary group or I've done it in some churches and whatever. I can't imagine that there's a denier that still a denier who might hear me tell the story. My video I put out in different groups like that you saw on Facebook. I think I've had 3,700 views so far on the video, and I've talked to 1,500 kids. I'm sure that if they meet up with somebody who is a denier, they will say, "Well, I heard this guy talk and his father talk, and no, you heard him. This happened." And they'll tell three or four others. Their parents will see the video. They might tell a neighbor or two or a friend, or relative. So hopefully I'm trying to get the word out. I'm getting the word out some, I can only do so much. And, people just need to get along with people, understand differences. There's so many different people in the world, and everybody has a story, and I try and tell the students, I said, and there were a lot of good people, that didn't go along with what was going on and hid people away and risked their own lives doing that. They call them upstanders, that didn't go along with the Nazis and killing people. Different religions, different sexes, different, sex orientations. I mean, people are different, but we need to get along. And I just hope that I bring it to the kids level and I say, okay, if you see bullying in school, what do you do? Do you join in? Whether it's emotional or, being nasty to somebody. If you have a new student that comes in and then they have an accent or they look different, you make them, you don't have to be their best friend, but you don't need to make fun of them or make them feel bad either. If there's bullying, do you join in or do you do something about it? Either you stop it or do you go to the teachers or somebody else or to your friends and say, this isn't right. And that's not right.
Yeah. I don't know if you might have mentioned it kind of briefly. Do you mind sharing? What were your parents' names?
Victor and Daisy. That was a nickname of my mother, but that's what she went by. Her real name was Teresa,
Victor and Daisy.
and
Okay.
my brother's
Did
name was George.
George. Okay. And we don't have to really talk in detail about this if you don't want to, nor do we need to, but just kind of general curiosity. Did your mom have a little bit harder time dealing with the aftermath of the Holocaust than your father did?
I imagine she did. Many, many years after she died, she suffered terribly from migraine headaches. I would say a couple times a week, she would just have an awful, awful migraine headache where she would just wrap a bandana around her head with rubbing alcohol so that she had the pain of the rubbing alcohol and take Anacin, and just sleep and whatever. Later on, and I don't know when this started, but she started drinking to put her out of her misery. So a few months before she committed suicide in January of '69, I found her passed out. This was like in October. I was home from school. At that point, I think she was passed out for a few days before she came through. Nobody thought whether she did it on purpose or not. She probably drank too much, maybe took some Valium too. I'm not sure. And then in January, she again passed out. Came to in about 24 hours. Everybody thought, oh, good. Wasn't the 3 days. She'll be better. And then she took a turn for the worse. Like one day I saw her, she was 48. The next day she looked like she was 98. And her kidney had failed. And then that night I think she vomited and then choked on the vomit, and her kidney had failed, and then she died. And many, many years later, and it was always a question mark whether she committed suicide or she just was, an accident. I never wanted to say that for many, many years that it was suicide, although I say it now. And many, many years later, a good friend of hers told my wife and I and said that she might have been a survivor, but that she was a casualty of the Holocaust. And I'm sure she spoke to her friend much more than she ever talked to me, so I'm sure she told her more.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that you had to go through that loss, and I'm so sorry your parents had to go through it, and all of the other 11 million. I mean, just can't.
Yeah. You know that the word genocide was not a word until after the Holocaust. It was not a word before the Holocaust. It was a doctor, I believe a doctor or a lawyer in, I think, England. I can't remember his name now, but he was asked about it. And he said, this was not a suicide. This is not a homicide. This is a genocide. This is a killing of a group of people. And it was not, many people don't realize that it was not a word. I mean, people use it so loosely nowadays, it drives me crazy.
Right,
But that's another
right.
subject.
And that's what I was thinking when you were sharing about your mom, and the migraine she had. And this is just me as a trauma therapist thinking like, I wonder if this is kind of a byproduct, right, of the trauma. Trauma can manifest in so many different ways with so many different types of people. And, they've done some research. I don't have the actual uh research documents in front of me, but it was kind of something in the a line with offspring. That doesn't sound right. Children of Holocaust survivors versus, somebody who was not a Holocaust survivor had so much more increased rates of PTSD and other issues, right? And they've done a lot of research on like epigenetics and the impact of the Holocaust. I mean, genetically for generations, just because it was so, I just believe it was so traumatic on not only a social level and a, economic level, but on a molecular level. And that was going to be one of my questions is, do you feel like, having parents who went through that, do you feel like you view the world a little bit differently than people who did not have that same experience with their parents?
I think so. And maybe more and more the older I get, and I try and tell the kids sometimes that I say, maybe you can put things in perspective. And after I tell them the story and what my parents went through, and I talk about, that everybody went through the pandemic. So that you were quarantined, you couldn't see your friends, you couldn't go to a movie, you couldn't go to a restaurant. Okay, but you woke up from a warm bed, you went to the kitchen and said, "Now what do I want for breakfast?" If you're having a bad day and your boyfriend, girlfriend breaks up with you, or you didn't get what you wanted for lunch, or whatever your bad day is, or you didn't get a grade that you wanted on a, okay, all right, let's put that in perspective. It's not so bad, you know. It could be a whole lot worse. So try and look on the bright side of things.
I love that. And I think that's so important because it is. I mean, I think that's another reason why it's so important to keep the memories alive because it does put our life, I feel, in perspective for my life. Like you said, I having moments where it's like, man, today sucks because it's just not going my way, right? I had to wait in traffic, whatever. The store didn't have what I wanted, so I had to go to the other store. And it does it. It makes you it's sobering to have these moments of like, well, it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
Um,
Tom, is there my kind of maybe last question? I think people are going to be surprised I didn't talk a whole lot, but this was just such a heavy but moving experience that I am grateful for. But is there any advice that you might have for people who may be grappling with their own family histories of trauma, even if it's not Holocaust exactly, but
Um, don't shy away from it. Ask questions and learn more about it, as hard as it might be. I kick myself sometimes that I wasn't strong enough to ask more about it while they were still alive. I learned a lot of stories, really the beginning to the end of my father's story, only in 1994. So I was 44 years old when my son was a senior in high school. When my father, when he did my son did an autobiography of my father for his senior project, and my father came up and spoke to his class, and many parents and teachers were there. That's really when I heard the story from the beginning to the end. Many times growing up, my father would say, if anybody started asking him questions about when and times and dates and so on, he would say, "Oh, it's all in that 24-page letter I wrote to Pepe, his cousin, after the war, telling him about family members and so on and what happened." But we never had that letter. I got that letter from my second cousin who had it about 4 or 5 years after my father died in the year 2000. I had it translated, and so I learned a lot of details then. I got a lot of information from the U.S. Holocaust Museum. I sat down with the historian there for about 2 hours. He was wonderful. I didn't even know I knew my mother's maiden name, but I didn't know her brother's name or her parents' names. And he was able to figure it out. And they have dates of moving from camp to camp and so on. Amazing records. So I've pieced together so many things afterwards, but I wish I was tougher to ask more questions while growing up,
Mm. Yeah.
even though it would have been hard and I would have been bawling,
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah. I don't see how you couldn't. And one of the kind of Chelsea and my our favorite way to make sure that we put a pretty bow on top is there anything that you wish somebody would ask you that you never get asked or we didn't ask? What would that be?
I don't know if you're going to want to do it, put any of this in, but I've been asked if my brother talks about it. My brother's a whole nother story. So I don't know if you want me to get into it or not.
Meaning like he kind of shies away from it. He doesn't want to talk about it?
No, and I'm sure you'll do some editing on this one.
No, it's fine.
It's a tough one for me, but I love talking about my brother. It's a sad story. He was amazing. He was an incredible athlete and brilliant, off the charts on both. Our high school to this day gives out an award in his memory to the scholar athlete, the graduating scholar athlete. He was, like I say, off the charts. There are records, and he had records in pole vaulting that still stand in his high school, in my high school. Soccer, he would score most of the goals on a winning team. He could do things with his body that most people can't do. When you have ropes in a gym where you try and climb up to the ceiling, all the kids, you wrap your feet around, whatever. He would have his legs straight out, go up with his hands down. He could walk around the gym on his hands. In our house, we had 2 floors. He would walk up and down the stairs on his hands. He could jump from the top step down to the bottom.
Wow.
Um,
Just totally
well,
gifted
yeah,
athletically.
totally gifted. There was a physical fitness test that President Kennedy did in the 60s that he started to get the students, the U.S. in better shape. He won in the whole New York metropolitan area. In 8th grade he came in second in the whole metropolitan area. In 9th grade, he won it all. 10th grade, he went away to a school to work on his skiing because his goal was to win the gold in the Olympics, not just to be in the Olympics, but to win the gold. He was driven. He could do anything. Then again, in 11th to 12th grade, he won again. His team won. They went to Washington, D.C., met President Kennedy. So when he had a full scholarship to Dartmouth, in his freshman year, he was training with the top 25 skiers in the United States in Vail, Colorado. He had a terrible fall on the downhill. He dislocated his right shoulder, his left elbow, and cracked his right elbow. And his arm was like this. He couldn't feed himself. He couldn't take himself to the bathroom. His right shoulder really never healed well. About a year and a half after he had the accident, the famous doctor who operated on Joe Namath's knee operated on it. Was about a 5.5-hour operation. They sewed things back together, ligaments and muscles and whatever, but it was never the same. After that, he, instead of being able to ski race himself, he would coach other kids. So anyway, like I say, he couldn't do the training anymore. He started taking drugs, took LSD, marijuana, LSD. Didn't want to go back to Dartmouth his sophomore year, but my parents talked him into it. He went to a campus policeman and said, "What would you do if I told you that I had marijuana in my room?" And he goes, "Nobody in their right mind tells the policeman that they have marijuana in their room." He brings him to the infirmary. They bring him they send him to New York. I'm not sure which hospital. It's either Gracie Square or Mount Sinai Hospital. And they treat him for schizophrenia, and they give him shock treatment, and which was awful. He couldn't remember things. He could remember family and close things, but acquaintances he couldn't remember. He was awful. He was in the hospital for maybe a couple months. Like my mother said, he was too good to be in the hospital, but too bad to be out of the hospital. And over the next 10 years, he was in and out of maybe 5 hospitals, attempted suicide a number of times, and eventually did commit suicide at the age of 30.
Tom. Oh, Tom.
So occasionally I'll tell the kids this story. And the reason I tell them is that, as you know, Billy, mental illness will affect, 25% of the students out there that were kids out there. And if they do have a problem, please go get help. There's medicine nowadays. They also diagnosed him as bipolar a few years later. So anyway, and like I say, he was my brother, my best friend, my hero.
Wow, Tom, thank you so much for sharing that. That really
So how much of that you want to put in the podcast? I don't know, but
no, yeah.
Tom, are you okay?
like I said,
Are
I
you
get
doing
emotional, but
okay?
I love telling the story because he was amazing, and he was, and years later, it's only a few years ago, I met somebody who was on that physical fitness team with him, and he was 3 years older than my brother. Okay, so now my brother's the punk little kid, beating everybody else, beating him. And he told me, and he said, "I think he was the best athlete I ever knew." And he wasn't just talking high school kids. And he goes, and the nicest thing was he was so humble about it. He never made you feel bad. I got into car racing, and he just was, and driving car was not a big thing to him. I love driving cars this day. And he would help me with my line around the track. And he was just, just happy for me and willing to help people. And once he couldn't, I said it before, but once he couldn't race himself, he would help other kids. He was a coach in a variety of different schools. He never never stayed at one job too long, but it's probably part of the illness, that it would kick in and kick out. He would have good times and bad times.
Yeah. Well, Tom,
So
this is,
what else would you like to ask?
I think my nervous system is saturated. I am still a little emotional, but, ooh,
If you want to ask guys that want to ask some stuff later that you think of, feel
no,
free. Feel free.
no, I
Did you get more
really,
than you bargained for?
I did.
Yes.
I
Yes.
did.
And in the best
The
kind of
best
way.
kind of, no.
It's just unbelievable. Unbelievable story where I kind of can't even believe that we've had the opportunity to speak with you, Tom. Like, this has been just absolutely a blessing. Like, I don't, so,
I guess I touched
Ooh,
both of you since you two of you are crying.
we're just all sitting around crying.
I know this is like just,
Oh,
I feel sorry for people who don't get these experiences. Like, I just feel so blessed and so fortunate to have talked with you, to heard about not only your life, but your mom and dad's life and your brother's life.
Victor and Daisy.
I know.
Um,
This has just been an amazing experience. So, oh man. But I think unfortunately that all things do have to come to a close at some point. But
Feel free to text me or
I
something,
was gonna say, Tom,
call if you want, or
yeah,
whatever.
I
no, and
love.
I appreciate you
If
so
you have other
much
questions,
for, yeah, I appreciate you so
thank
much
you,
for sharing.
thank you.
You,
I like doing it. Now that
yeah,
I've done it so many times in school, so I want to get that story out.
yeah. Well, you're incredible. Your family's incredible.
Thank you,
And we are just, ooh, so appreciative.
Yeah,
thank you.
Tom. So,
Yeah.
well, guys, as we always say, thank you for hanging out with us on this wild
Super intense.
ride.
Yeah,
And
this wild and crazy ride.
we will catch you on the wild side.
Bye, guys.
Later, Gators. Hey, Wildside Tribe, don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Wildside Podcast.
Make sure to tune in on Wildside Wednesdays. New episodes will drop each Wednesday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
We would love to hear from you, so if you have a wild case recommendation, email us at wildsidepodcast@gmail.com. That's wildside with a C. Or share your thoughts in the comments below.
As always, if you haven't heard it today, you're loved, you're worthy, and you're valuable. And we'll catch you on
The flip side.